Here are two things that my study of history has taught me. First, throughout the history of mankind, the way humans think has changed very little. Second, through those very same centuries, the way humans think has changed a lot. I'm not sure which is more true, but today we're going to look at a demonstration of the second proposition, using this page from a medieval encyclopedia as our lens. What we'll find is a great example of how technology, quite literally, changes the way we present the world. The map itself is from 1493, just 2 years after Columbus's first voyage. Printing is still a new technology, and though our map was produced on a press, it is still firmly medieval in style and content. It's a map of Bavaria, and it's one of over 600 diagrams and illustrations in an amazing encyclopedia, the Nuremberg Chronicle. Very, very few examples of medieval maps have survived to the present day to study. We'll see what we can learn from studying this one. Welcome to the Eye of History. I collect maps, and maps are my inspiration for each and every video. Here we explore history, technology, culture, economics, all that we can learn from what is the map and what is on the map. And if deep dives into diverse subjects appeal to you, then like, share, and subscribe. It really helps nerdy channels like this one. Maps were a rarity in the Middle Ages. Travelers navigated by verbal instructions, oral or written, not by maps. Even mariners generally used rutters, written collections of instructions regarding each port en route. The reason for the rarity is simple. In those days, to copy anything meant to copy by hand. It isn't hard to copy written instructions, and to do so reliably. But without the aid of tracing paper, copying any sort of map or illustration was hard. And to do so accurately was painstaking work, so it was rarely done. Our map comes from the Nuremberg Chronicle, printed in 1493. And yes, I said printed, and you might question then whether this really counts as a medieval map. I'll get to that in a moment, but first let me describe this book that contained it. The Nuremberg Chronicle was one of the earliest encyclopedias, perhaps the first printed encyclopedia really worthy of the description. And it was an ambitious project, to say the least. It was over 600 pages, and most were enhanced with beautiful woodcuts like our map. The entries in the Chronicle were mostly about people and places, and was unlike modern encyclopedias in that the entries were organized roughly chronologically. Just as Genesis described the creation of the world in 7 days, the Chronicle described the history of the world in 7 ages. The first age covering from the Garden of Eden to Noah's flood, the 7th age covering the end days of the apocalypse. According to this chronology, we're living in the 6th age, which began with the birth of Christ. The Chronicle reads very differently than a modern history. It's mostly a long litany of anecdotes and brief reports. Who did what, to who, and where. The early ages drew heavily from the Bible, of course, with a liberal sprinkling of information from classical sources like Strabo and Philostratus. It's often credulous. The physician Galen lived to an age of 200, and adorned with accounts like that of the evil Bishop Hatto, who was, quote, killed by lightning and snatched away by demons. As he fell from a mountain in Sicily into a fiery spring, a voice in the air said, "Thus may you pay for your sins, and thus by falling down you may be ruined." There was no theorizing, no deep analysis. There were villains and heroes, to be sure, and a narrative of God's providence and justice, but never any attempts towards a deeper interpretation. In some ways, it's quite refreshing. That said, there is an earnest attempt at accuracy, and to any reader of the day, it would have been an invaluable treasure. The question still remains, can we really call this a medieval document, even though it's printed? The content is definitely consistent with other late medieval works. We generally associate the use of classical sources with the Renaissance, but medieval writers drew upon them too. They just had fewer sources to draw from. But there's another proof that the Chronicle was printed with a manuscript mindset. Let's zoom in on the text itself. If you know only a little Latin, you might be baffled by the marks and symbols that I've marked here in red. You don't see these in modern Latin. It's been a few hundred years since they've been common. These are called brachygraphia, a system with various types of abbreviations and symbols that was invented by scribes to reduce their workload and save space on the expensive parchment. Old manuscripts are filled with brachygraphia. About 14,000 different abbreviations and symbols have been cataloged. But printers, especially the typesetters, hated them. When setting up type for printing, these symbols require extra care, and the sorts, that is to say the letters, take up spots in their typecase. If printers had their way, we'd have as few letters in the alphabet as possible. It saves the cost of making the type sorts and speeds up the setup immensely. It didn't take long for the brochografia to disappear, although a little bit of it still survives today. The apostrophe, the ampersand. That we find so much brochografia in our text tells us that the people producing it were still working in that same medieval mode as the copyists in the monasteries that preceded them. In fact, at this time, manuscripts were still regularly being copied by hand, as book publishing only made financial sense if the print run was large enough. Our encyclopedia was produced in a world in flux, but the Chronicle is unquestionably a medieval artifact. What the Chronicle places before us is a woodcut image of a broad river meandering in a landscape of fields, castles, and cities. The style is characteristic of the late medieval period, but we have to be careful with our interpretation, as the popularity of the Nuremberg Chronicle was such that it largely defined the style that we call late medieval. The question we have to answer before we can continue is this really a map? Now let's approach this question with a little humility. Imagine taking a road trip today and needing to get directions. For the moment, we'll assume that you're beyond cell phone range. You ask your passenger to get the road map out of the glove compartment. Your passenger, who is under the age of, well, maybe 40, pulls out the tattered gas station road map that has been moldering there for a decade or two and asks, "Is this what you mean?" As she carefully unfolds it, as it tears at every crease, she finally recognizes it. "Oh," she says, "it's like you printed a screenshot of a real map." To a youth like her, a map is an interactive computer tool for getting directions and visualizing data. To someone of my advanced age, a map is a printed representation of real geography and relevant features and attributes. To the creators of the Chronicle, a map is a hand-drawn illustration depicting knowledge about a place that words can't quite capture. As technology changes and our needs change, the form a map takes has also changed. What all have in common is that a map conveys information about a place, using whatever medium is available. That medium may be ink on paper, pixels on a computer screen, or a planetarium projector. Does a map have to be physically accurate? This subway system map clearly isn't, but it clearly is a map. To be a map, it simply has to convey what its creator wishes to communicate about the subject. The form maps take has always been shaped by the technology available. Before printing was commonplace, copying maps accurately was all but impossible. There was no tracing paper and no pantograph, so maps did not try to be accurate. The sole exception were the portolans, those are sea charts, which were extremely prized, extremely expensive, and kept to a very limited audience. Maps instead were schematic. Romans made the Putinger tables, which shows the imperial road network in the cities they connect fairly well. But distances and directions are arbitrary, and the seas and coastlines completely distorted. Christian writers illustrated the form of the world with what we call TO maps, which placed Jerusalem at the center of an earth all but filled by the three continents of Asia, Europe, and Africa. Mappa Mundi purported to be world maps, but they would have been useless to any navigator. After the invention of printing, maps didn't immediately change. Actually, very few maps were printed in the early decades of printing at all, as there simply was no precedent. Much of what was printed in those first decades were copies of older manuscripts, most prominently the Bible, and so maps remained rare. This is why our map preserves the medieval mindset. It was made with a copyist in mind, not the printer. So let's see what our map is trying to convey. The text shall be our guide. It's Bavaria, as even my poor Latin skills are sufficient to read the first word in the text. The text tells us that it's an extensive territory bordering on Franconia in the north and Swabia to the west. Google Earth will help us find it. First, we'll find its position in Europe. And then zooming in, you can see the Swiss Alps to the south and Austria to the east, Franconia and Swabia right where the text says. By the way, I've put the whole text in English in the description. The map is dominated by the broad, meandering river, which the text assures us is the Danube. At the bottom of the map, it is passing through a hilly territory. On the left is a city, I think actually two, with walls and large cathedrals. On the right is a rustic village, with plowed fields, corrals, a well, and a more modest church. The scale is inconsistent. Though some of the roofline shows some use of perspective, the mapmaker was not trying to draw a portrait. At center is what appears to be a cathedral or an abbey on an island. This element is the closest to being representational. I believe it to be Passau, a cathedral city on a narrow peninsula. Just beyond it is another rustic village on a forested hill, and a little further is a large city that boasts a Gothic cathedral. That could be Regensburg or Freising. There are more castles, abbeys, and towns, some perched over cliffs. I am reminded of castles like Hohenschwangau in Trosnitz, very typical of Bavaria. Beyond the castles, our Danube flows into a sea, with several ships sailing beyond. In truth, the Black Sea is 1,000 miles downstream from Bavaria, but the map communicates both how central the Danube was physically and how important it was economically. The Danubian trade routes were at their peak in this era. Trade with the East had not yet been disrupted by the Portuguese discovery of the routes around Africa. And by bringing the Black Sea so close, the mapmaker expresses how important that outlet was in this era. To summarize, the map effectively describes Bavaria in a way that complemented the text, showing visually what the written word cannot fully capture. But unlike more modern maps, this map could be copied by any artist with a modicum of talent. A great artist might even have improved it in the process. It is precisely what the technology of the medieval era called for. So today we learned that, with a very few expensive exceptions, medieval maps were schematics. So too was medieval portraiture, and for the same reasons. Medieval art is often mocked today for it, but this is unfair. We tend to compare medieval portraits with either Renaissance or Roman portraiture. Comparing it with what came later is obviously unfair. Comparing it with the frescoes of Pompeii is also unfair, since so few personal portraits from the Middle Ages have survived. If only a volcano would have enveloped Paris in volcanic ash in, say, 1200 AD, maybe we could see what people had in their private homes. But since there was no such disaster, we really just don't know. What did survive was almost entirely portraits of saints and kings, people the artist never saw and could not possibly render in the faithful style we expect today. These were also people who represented something: faith, strength, charity, wisdom. The artist's task was to display these traits and add just enough details, curly hair, a long beard, to identify the subject. It was not a defect in medieval artistry, but a feature. The artists were talented. Medieval art was often gorgeous. It was simply that their purpose was to illustrate substance, not mimic forms. In the introduction, I said that I had learned that through history, the way we think changed very little, and the way we think changed a lot. So which is it? From our maps and illustrations, it seems that medieval people thought in more broad, schematic terms than we do today. Archetypes had precedence over the individual. Many scholars like to claim that the Middle Ages could not see the individual at all, and that science was all alchemy, easily fooled by appearances, never thinking to test and measure. But I'm skeptical of that reading. Measurements did matter in the Middle Ages. The builders of this Gothic cathedral could not proceed without very detailed, very careful measurements. Manorial accounts were kept just as carefully. Astronomy was an arithmetically rigorous science. Medieval man did not lack the capacity to use precise diagrammatic knowledge. What was different then was not how they thought, but how they communicated. And communication shapes a society. What a society communicates is what a society thinks. And inevitably, that shapes what the individual is interested in. So medieval literature loved metaphor. Medieval philosophy was interested in qualities, not quantities. What is striking about the Chronicles is the near complete absence of numbers. Other than the strangely precise statement that in its 477th year, Rome had 292,334 inhabitants, populations are described by their qualities, their ethnicity, their poverty, their proclivities towards war. Even the study of what we would call physics today was approached qualitatively. It was wrapped up in paradoxes of infinity and the infinitesimal. Even the basic principles of motion evaded quantification. Speed was difficult to understand. Acceleration impossible to discuss. But though medieval science was stunted by the lack of diagrammatic precision, medieval philosophy was rich. For the medievalist, it is striking how often modern philosophers were fully anticipated by their medieval predecessors. If you thought that medieval thinkers were obsessed with counting angels on the head of a pin, you could not be more mistaken. That quote, by the way, itself dates to the Middle Ages and was a warning against pedantry. There is hardly a modern philosophical idea that the medievals did not anticipate, save, of course, those that stem from the most modern mathematical and physical ideas. Now for the appraisal. If the Nuremberg Chronicle was merely an encyclopedia, it would be valuable to collectors. But with over 600 woodcuts, it is among the most collectible titles of the era. And there is the chance that a young Albrecht Dürer worked on it. After all, his godfather was the publisher. Unfortunately, none of the woodcuts are signed, and some dozens of artists and engravers were involved in their production. There are some that claim they can identify Dürer's work amongst the illustrations, but I'm skeptical. The Nuremberg Chronicles were very successful. 1,500 of the Latin versions were printed, an enormous number in that era, and there was a German version and many copycats. A few hundred still exist intact in museums and private collections, and they occasionally come up for auction. Full Nuremberg Chronicles have fetched auction prices of nearly $500,000, and that's for a Latin version with excellent coloring. On the other hand, I've seen a German edition, uncolored, sell at an auction for under $100,000. Even that is well beyond the reach of most of us, but fortunately, individual pages are easily available. The prices vary considerably depending on the specific page and edition, as well as the usual considerations of condition and color. The most desirable pages, well colored, can push into the several thousands of dollars, while the least desirable pages can sell for just a couple $100. When looking at pages, be aware that to the map dealer, only the map counts. The dimensions a map dealer gives will be the dimensions of the map, not the map and text together. This particular page has the benefits of being from the more desirable Latin edition, but the subject is of middling interest. Pages that show astronomical diagrams or other special topics get the most interest. The condition is very good, and it's a good impression, but it's not colored. It would sell near the lower end of the market, perhaps $300 or $400, which in my opinion is a bargain for a 500-year-old artifact of any kind. As a collector, one thing to know is that these pages turn up at auctions very frequently, often with auctioneers that don't know what they're looking at. This particular page was mislabeled by someone at the auction house that couldn't read the word Bavaria because it was in Latin. That probably helped me get a little better price, but be aware that those sorts of mistakes can work against you too. As they say, caveat emptor, and all sales are final. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you have questions or ideas for future videos, please leave a comment. And if you'd like to take a stab at translating the Latin yourself, as ever, a scan of the map is linked in the description.